Have you ever wondered what it would be like to step through a heavy wooden door in 19th century Cairo and find yourself in a world completely removed from the dusty streets outside? A world where time moves differently, where conversations drift like smoke through dimly lit rooms, and where the very air seems thick with stories waiting to be told. Well, tonight we're going to take that walk together. We're going to explore the Hashish houses of Cairo during one of the most fascinating periods in Egyptian history. These weren't just places where people went to escape reality. They were cultural institutions, gathering spots for artists and intellectuals, spaces where the rigid social hierarchies of Ottoman Egypt could momentarily dissolve into something more fluid and human. But here's what makes this story truly captivating. While European travelers were writing sensationalized accounts of these establishments for their scandalized readers back home, the reality was far more nuanced and beautiful than any Orientalist fantasy could capture. These were places where ordinary people created extraordinary moments of connection and creativity. I'm going to walk you through the narrow alleyways of medieval Cairo, past the coffee houses, and into the more secretive world of the Hashish salon. You'll meet the regular patrons, hear their stories, and understand how these spaces fit into the broader tapestry of Egyptian social life. We'll explore how the smoking rituals developed, what role these houses played during times of political upheaval, and why they represented something much deeper than simple intoxication. The story begins in the winding streets of the Gamaliya district, where the scent of burning charcoal mixed with something sweeter, more intoxicating. Picture yourself walking these streets as the call to evening prayer echoes across the rooftops, when the merchants are closing their shops and a different kind of commerce begins to emerge from the shadows. In the early 1800s, Cairo was a city caught between worlds. The Ottoman Empire still held nominal control, but real power was shifting toward the ambitious Muhammad Ali Pasha, who would soon transform Egypt into something resembling a modern state. Yet in the narrow alleyways where our story unfolds, older rhythms persisted. Here, the medieval city lived on, with its guild structures, its religious brotherhoods, and its informal networks of sociability that connected people across class lines in ways that would have been impossible in more formal settings. The Hashish house emerged from this complex social landscape as something uniquely Egyptian. Unlike the coffee houses, which had become spaces of political discussion and sometimes dangerous debate, the Hashish salon operated according to different rules. Politics were generally left at the door. Social status mattered less than one's ability to contribute to the collective atmosphere of contemplation and conversation. Ahmed al-Tantawi was one of the most famous proprietors of such an establishment in the Husseiniya quarter. His house occupied the ground floor of a 3-story building that had once belonged to a prosperous merchant family. When you pushed through the heavy curtain that served as his door, you entered a world that seemed to exist outside of time itself. The main room was long and narrow, with low divans arranged along the walls. Brass braziers provided the only light, casting dancing shadows across the faces of the assembled patrons. Al-Tantawi himself was a man of perhaps 50 years, with intelligent eyes and hands stained dark from years of preparing his special blends. He had learned his craft from his father, who had learned from his father before him, creating a lineage that stretched back into the 18th century. But Ahmad was more than just a supplier of intoxicants. He was a curator of experiences, someone who understood that the real product he was selling was not hashish, but transformation. The clientele who gathered in his establishment represented a cross-section of Cairo society that you could not have found anywhere else. There was Mahmoud the copyist, a man who spent his days hunched over manuscripts in the scriptoriums of Al-Ajar, his fingers permanently stained with ink. In the Hashish house, he became a storyteller, spinning tales that drew from the vast library he carried in his memory. His voice would grow soft and rhythmic as the evening progressed, weaving together fragments of classical poetry with stories from his own life in ways that made the boundaries between literature and experience dissolve completely. Sitting near him on most evenings was Hassan the barber, whose small shop near the Khan al-Khalili Bazaar brought him into contact with travelers from across the Ottoman world. He collected stories the way other men collected coins, and in the dim light of Al-Tantawi's establishment, he would share accounts of distant cities and strange customs that transported his listeners far beyond the confines of their immediate world. His tales of Istanbul's grand bazaars and Damascus's rose gardens became more vivid and detailed with each retelling, until they took on the quality of shared memories rather than second-hand accounts. But perhaps the most regular patron was an elderly man known simply as Abu Yusuf. No one knew his real name or his occupation, though his hands suggested a lifetime of careful work, possibly as a jeweler or metalsmith. He rarely spoke, but when he did, his words carried unusual weight. He had a way of asking questions that would send the conversation in unexpected directions, opening up topics that revealed hidden depths in even the most mundane subjects. The ritual of consumption in these establishments followed patterns that had evolved over generations. The hashish itself was prepared with elaborate care, mixed with tobacco and sometimes sweetened with honey or perfumed with rose water. It was not simply a matter of getting intoxicated, but of creating a shared experience that would unfold over the course of several hours. The preparation itself became a kind of ceremony, with Al-Tantawi moving between his patrons like a host at a dinner party, gauging the mood of the room and adjusting his blends accordingly. The pipe, or goza, was passed from person to person according to subtle protocols that newcomers had to learn through observation. There was an etiquette to receiving it, a particular way of holding it, and an understanding about how long one should keep it before passing it along. These rituals served multiple purposes. They created a sense of community and shared purpose, but they also regulated the pace of consumption, ensuring that the evening would unfold gradually rather than rushing towards some predetermined climax. As the effects of the hashish began to take hold, the character of conversation would shift. The rapid-fire exchanges of the coffee house gave way to something more contemplative and flowing. Ideas would be examined from multiple angles, turned over like precious stones to catch different aspects of their brilliance. A simple observation about the way light fell through a window might spark a discussion that wound through poetry, philosophy, and personal memory, connecting seemingly unrelated topics in ways that revealed hidden patterns. Music played an important role in these gatherings, though not in the formal sense of scheduled performances. Someone might begin humming a traditional melody, and others would join in, their voices blending in harmonies that seemed to emerge spontaneously from the collective mood. These musical interludes were not entertainment in the usual sense, but rather expressions of the shared emotional state of the group. They served as bridges between different topics of conversation, or as ways of processing particularly moving stories or insights. The physical environment of the hashish house was designed to support these kinds of experiences. The low lighting created intimacy, while also making it easier for patrons to lose themselves in internal contemplation. The soft furnishings and cushioned seating encouraged relaxation, and the kind of bodily comfort that made it possible to remain in one place for hours. The air itself became part of the experience, thick with aromatic smoke that seemed to slow time and soften the edges of ordinary consciousness. European visitors to Cairo often wrote about these establishments, though their accounts were typically colored by their own cultural assumptions and prejudices. They saw only the exotic surface, missing the deeper social functions these spaces served. What they described as decadent lounging was actually a highly refined form of social interaction, one that created possibilities for connection and creativity that were difficult to achieve in other contexts. The reality was far more subtle and meaningful than these outside observers understood. In a society where social mobility was limited and individual expression was often constrained by traditional hierarchies, the Hashish house offered a temporary escape from these restrictions. Here, a humble craftsman could hold forth on philosophical questions with the same authority as someone born to wealth and education. Here, the usual markers of social status became less important than one's ability to contribute to the collective exploration of ideas and experiences. This democratizing effect was one of the most significant aspects of Hashish house culture. In the broader society of 19th century Egypt, interactions between different social classes were heavily regulated by custom and law. A barber and a scholar, for example, might conduct business together, but they would rarely engage in the kind of extended, intimate conversation that revealed their deeper thoughts and feelings. In the Hashish house, these barriers could temporarily dissolve, creating possibilities for human connection that transcended the rigid categories of everyday social life. The stories that emerged from these gatherings became part of the oral culture of Cairo, spreading through the city's networks of sociability like ripples in a pond. A particularly moving tale told in one establishment might be retold in coffeehouses and family gatherings, often evolving and gaining new layers of meaning with each retelling. In this way, the Hashish houses served as centers of cultural creativity, places where new stories were born and existing ones were transformed through the collective imagination of their patrons. As the night deepened and the effects of the hashish intensified, the boundary between individual consciousness and group experience would begin to blur. Conversations might fragment into multiple simultaneous discussions, or they might converge into moments of shared silence that felt more communicative than words. These were the moments that regular patrons treasured most, when the artificial divisions between self and other seemed to dissolve, revealing a deeper unity that connected all present. The transformation that occurred in these spaces was not merely chemical, but profoundly psychological and social. As patrons settled deeper into their cushions and the hashish began to weave its subtle influence through their consciousness, the very nature of identity seemed to shift. The careful masks that people wore in their daily interactions, the professional personas and social roles that defined them in the outside world, would gradually soften and sometimes disappear entirely. This process of transformation was perhaps most visible in the way people spoke about their lives and dreams. Mahmoud the copyist, who during daylight hours moved through the halls of Al-Azhar with the quiet deference expected of his station, would find his voice taking on new authority as he recounted not just the texts he copied, but his own interpretations of their meanings. The careful boundaries between scholar and scribe, between those who created knowledge and those who merely preserved it, would blur in the amber light of the braziers. His stories would often begin with something he had encountered in a manuscript that day, perhaps a passage from Ibn Sina on the nature of consciousness, or a poem by al-Mutanabi that had struck him with particular force. But as the evening progressed and the hashish deepened his contemplative state, these scholarly references would become launching points for deeply personal reflections. He would speak about moments of revelation that had come to him while copying, instances where the act of transcription had become a form of meditation that opened up new understanding. Hassan the barber would undergo a similar metamorphosis, though his transformation followed different patterns. During his working hours, he was expected to be deferential to his customers, to listen more than he spoke, to provide not just grooming services, but also a kind of informal therapy for men who needed someone safe to confide in. In the hashish house, these accumulated stories and confidences would resurface as material for his own creative expression. He had developed an extraordinary ability to weave together fragments of conversation he had overheard, creating composite characters and situations that felt completely real, even though they were assembled from dozens of different sources. His tales of merchants who had lost fortunes to bad investments, of young men struggling with unrequited love, of families torn apart by political upheaval, were not reportage in any literal sense, but rather a kind of social poetry that captured emotional truths about the human condition The elderly Abu Yusuf represented yet another mode of transformation. While the younger men used the Hashish house as a space to expand and express themselves, he seemed to use it as a place to distill his accumulated wisdom into its most essential forms. His questions and observations had a quality of profound simplicity that suggested decades of careful thought. When he spoke about the nature of happiness or the relationship between tradition and change, his words carried the weight of lived experience refined through years of contemplation. These individual transformations created a collective atmosphere that was greater than the sum of its parts. As each person shed their daytime persona and revealed more authentic aspects of themselves, the entire group would enter into a state of heightened receptivity and creativity. Conversations would develop their own momentum, following unexpected paths that none of the participants could have planned or predicted. The physical rituals that structured these evenings played a crucial role in facilitating these transformations. The passing of the pipe created natural rhythms that prevented any individual from dominating the conversation, while ensuring that everyone had opportunities to contribute. The preparation of tea and the sharing of simple foods, dates and nuts and pieces of honeyed pastry created additional moments of connection and care that reinforced the sense of community. Al-Tantawi moved through these rituals with the skill of someone who understood their deeper purposes. He was not simply providing a product, but orchestrating an experience that required careful attention to timing, atmosphere, and the subtle dynamics between his patrons. He knew which combinations of people were likely to create the most interesting conversations, and he would sometimes guide the seating arrangements to encourage particular kinds of interactions. His establishment was arranged in a way that supported both intimate conversation and larger group discussions. The main room had several distinct seating areas, each with its own character and atmosphere. Near the entrance, there was a space for newer patrons or those who preferred to observe before participating fully. The center of the room featured the most comfortable cushions and the best access to the braziers, reserved for regular customers who had earned their place through consistent participation in the life of the establishment. In the back, there was a smaller alcove that provided more privacy for conversations that required discretion. This was where people would go to discuss personal problems, to seek advice about family matters, or to share stories that were too intimate for the larger group. The placement of this space, partially hidden from the main room but still connected to it, reflected Al-Tantawi's understanding that people needed different levels of exposure and privacy depending on their mood and the nature of what they wanted to share. The decoration of the space also contributed to its transformative power. The walls were covered with geometric patterns that seemed to shift and flow in the flickering light of the braziers. These designs, drawn from traditional Islamic art, had a hypnotic quality that enhanced the effects of the hashish, while also creating a sense of connection to broader cultural traditions. Verses from classical poetry were inscribed in elegant calligraphy around the room, providing inspiration for conversation and contemplation. The selection of these verses revealed Al-Tantawi's own literary sensibilities and his understanding of his patrons' interests. He had chosen passages that dealt with themes of love, loss, spiritual seeking, and the search for meaning in an uncertain world. These were topics that resonated deeply with people who came to his establishment seeking something more than mere intoxication. They were looking for connection, understanding, and perhaps most importantly, a sense that their individual struggles and joys were part of larger patterns of human experience. As winter evenings grew longer and the cold drove people indoors earlier, the hashish house would take on an even more intimate character. The contrast between the harsh realities of the outside world and the warm, protected atmosphere inside became more pronounced. Patrons would arrive earlier and stay later, creating extended sessions that could stretch well into the hours before dawn. These longer gatherings allowed for different kinds of conversations to develop. The rushed exchanges of shorter visits gave way to more extended explorations of complex topics. Someone might begin telling a story in the early evening and return to it repeatedly throughout the night, adding new details and perspectives, as the effects of the hashish deepened their ability to access memories and emotions that were normally hidden from conscious awareness. The seasonal rhythms of Cairo life were reflected in the patterns of hashish house attendance. During Ramadan, when the consumption of food and drink was forbidden during daylight hours, these establishments would take on special significance as places where people could gather after sunset to break their fast in a contemplative atmosphere. The combination of physical hunger satisfied and consciousness altered by hashish created particularly intense experiences of gratitude and connection. Religious festivals and political events would also influence the character of these gatherings. During times of celebration, the mood would be more festive, with more music and laughter mixing with the usual philosophical discussions. During periods of uncertainty or crisis, the hashish house would become a refuge where people could process their anxieties and fears in a supportive environment. The relationship between hashish house culture and the broader religious life of Cairo was complex and often misunderstood by outside observers. While Orthodox Islamic authorities generally disapproved of hashish consumption, many patrons of these establishments were deeply religious people who saw no contradiction between their spiritual practices and their participation in hashish house gatherings. They understood both activities as different ways of seeking connection with the divine and with their fellow human beings. Some of the most profound conversations in these establishments centered on questions of faith and spiritual experience. Patrons would discuss their understanding of Islamic teachings, share insights from their prayers and meditations, and explore the relationship between individual consciousness and divine reality. These discussions were not academic exercises, but deeply personal explorations that drew on both traditional religious knowledge and direct spiritual experience. The hashish itself was sometimes understood as a tool for spiritual exploration, rather than simply a recreational drug. Many patrons believed that it could help them achieve states of consciousness that were conducive to prayer and contemplation. They would describe experiences of enhanced clarity and insight that helped them understand religious texts in new ways, or feel more connected to the divine presence in their daily lives. This spiritual dimension of hashish house culture was one of the aspects that European observers found most difficult to understand. Coming from societies where drug use was typically associated with moral degradation and social problems, they could not easily comprehend how intoxication might be integrated into a serious spiritual practice. Their accounts often emphasize the exotic and sensational aspects of what they witnessed, while missing the deeper religious and philosophical dimensions that gave these experiences their real meaning for participants. The economic aspects of hashish house operation were also more complex than they might initially appear. While Al-Tantawi and other proprietors certainly needed to make a profit to sustain their businesses, they were also providing what amounted to a social service for their communities. They created spaces where people could find relief from the stresses and isolation of urban life, where they could connect with others who shared their interests and concerns, and where they could explore aspects of themselves that had no outlet in more conventional social settings. The cost of participation was kept low enough that people from various economic backgrounds could afford to attend regularly. Al-Tantawi would sometimes extend credit to regular patrons who were experiencing temporary financial difficulties, understanding that the continuity of the community was more important than immediate profit. He also provided different grades of hashish at different price points, ensuring that everyone could participate according to their means. The relationships between proprietors and their regular patrons extended far beyond simple commercial transactions. Al-Tantawi knew the personal histories of most of his customers, their family situations, their professional challenges, and their private dreams. This knowledge allowed him to create an atmosphere that was genuinely nurturing rather than merely profitable. When Mahmoud was struggling with a difficult manuscript that required weeks of painstaking work, Al-Tantawi would prepare milder blends that enhanced concentration rather than promoting the dreamy introspection that might be appropriate for other evenings. Similarly, when Hassan was dealing with the death of his elderly father, the Hashish house became a space where he could process his grief in the company of people who understood the complex emotions involved in such loss. The conversations that emerged during this period were not forced or artificial attempts at consolation, but rather organic explorations of memory, mortality, and the ways that love persists even after death. Other patrons would share their own experiences of loss, creating a web of shared understanding that helped Hassan navigate his mourning process. This kind of emotional support was one of the most important functions that hashish houses served in the social fabric of Cairo. In a society where extended families were often separated by economic necessity, and where traditional support systems were being strained by rapid social change, these establishments provided alternative communities for people who might otherwise face their challenges alone. The altered consciousness produced by hashish made it easier for people to be vulnerable with each other, to share fears and hopes that they might never express in ordinary social situations. The stories that circulated in these spaces often dealt with universal human experiences, but they were always grounded in the specific details of Egyptian life. Abu Yusuf would tell tales of craftsmen who had spent decades perfecting their skills, only to find their traditional techniques being replaced by new methods imported from Europe. His stories captured both the sadness of seeing ancient knowledge disappear and the excitement of discovering new possibilities for creative expression. These narratives reflected the broader tensions that were reshaping Egyptian society during this period. The modernizing reforms of Muhammad Ali Pasha were bringing new technologies, new forms of education, and new economic opportunities to the country. But they were also disrupting traditional ways of life that had provided meaning and identity for countless generations. The hashish house became a space where people could explore these changes and their implications in a contemplative, rather than anxious way. The architecture of these establishments reflected their function as transitional spaces between the traditional and the modern. While the basic layout followed patterns that had been established centuries earlier, many proprietors were beginning to incorporate elements that reflected contemporary influences. Al-Tantawi had recently installed a large mirror imported from Venice, which created new visual dynamics in the main room. The way it reflected the light from the braziers and the faces of the patrons added an extra layer of complexity to the already rich visual environment. He had also begun experimenting with new blends that incorporated tobaccos from different regions of the Ottoman Empire. These innovations were not random attempts at novelty, but careful explorations of how different combinations might enhance particular aspects of the hashish house experience. A tobacco from Syria might promote more vivid storytelling, while one from Anatolia might encourage deeper philosophical reflection. Al-Tantawi approached these experiments with the same careful attention that a chef might bring to developing new recipes, understanding that his role was to create experiences that would serve the needs of his community. The seasonal variations in these blends reflected the rhythms of Cairo life and the changing needs of the patrons throughout the year. During the hot summer months, when the city became almost unbearable during the day, the evening gatherings took on special importance as people sought relief not just from the physical heat, but from the irritability and exhaustion it produced. Al-Tantawi would prepare cooling blends infused with mint and rose water that helped people transition from the harshness of the day to the gentleness of evening contemplation. The autumn months brought their own character to the hashish house experience. As the oppressive heat finally broke and the city became more comfortable, there was often a sense of renewal and possibility in the air. Conversations would turn toward new projects and plans, toward dreams that had been put on hold during the difficult summer months. The hashish seemed to enhance this sense of possibility, helping people envision futures that might have seemed impossible during the harsh reality of daily survival. Winter evenings created the most intimate atmosphere in these establishments. The contrast between the cold streets and the warm interior made the Hashish house feel like a sanctuary from the external world. Patrons would arrive bundled in heavy cloaks and scarves, gradually shedding these layers as they settled into the comfortable cushions and allowed the warmth of the braziers to penetrate their chilled bodies. This physical process of warming and relaxation became a metaphor for the psychological transformation that would follow as the evening progressed. The spring months brought their own unique energy to these gatherings. As the city awakened from its winter dormancy, a new life began appearing in gardens and courtyards throughout Cairo. The conversations in the Hashish house would often turn toward themes of growth and renewal. People would share their hopes for the coming year, their plans for new ventures, and their reflections on the cycles of change that governed both individual lives and the broader community. These seasonal rhythms were not just background to the Hashish house experience, but integral parts of its meaning. The regular patrons developed a deep appreciation for how the character of their gatherings shifted throughout the year, and they would often reference these changes in their conversations. Abu Yusuf might observe that a particular story could only be properly told during the melancholy days of late autumn, while Hassan might note that certain kinds of humor only worked during the festive atmosphere of spring evenings. The relationship between the Hashish house and the surrounding neighborhood was complex and generally positive, despite the semi-legal status of these establishments. Most local residents understood that these places served important social functions and that their patrons were generally peaceful people who caused no trouble for their neighbors. The sound of quiet conversation and occasional laughter that drifted from these establishments was considered part of the normal nighttime soundscape of the district. Local merchants often had informal relationships with Hashish house proprietors, providing them with special items that enhanced the experience of their patrons. A spice seller might offer rare incenses that could be burned in the braziers to create particular aromatic effects. A confectioner might develop special sweets designed to complement the taste of hashish and enhance its effects. These commercial relationships were part of the broader network of cooperation that made neighborhood life possible in medieval Cairo. The children of the district grew up understanding that the hashish houses were part of their community, though they were also taught that these were adult spaces that were not appropriate for them to enter. They would sometimes catch glimpses of the interior when the heavy curtains were briefly opened, and these fleeting images would contribute to their understanding of the complex adult world that surrounded them. The Hashish house became part of the mythology of growing up, a symbol of the mysteries and privileges that awaited them in maturity. Women had a complicated relationship with Hashish house culture, though their exclusion from these male spaces did not mean they were entirely separate from their influence. The stories and insights that men brought home from their evening gatherings would often become part of family conversations, influencing the broader cultural life of the community. Some women developed their own informal networks for sharing hashish and engaging in the kinds of contemplative conversations that characterized the male establishments, though these gatherings were necessarily more private and less visible to outside observers. The influence of Hashish house culture on the broader artistic and intellectual life of Cairo was significant but often indirect. The enhanced creativity and altered perspectives that people experienced in these establishments would carry over into their daily work and social interactions. Mahmud would bring new interpretive insights to his manuscript copying, finding connections between texts that he might never have noticed in his ordinary state of consciousness. Hassan would develop new storytelling techniques that made his barbershop conversations more engaging and memorable. The collaborative nature of Hashish house conversations also influenced the way people approached problems and creative challenges in their professional lives. The techniques for building on each other's ideas, for exploring topics from multiple perspectives, and for finding unexpected connections between seemingly unrelated concepts became part of their general intellectual toolkit. These skills proved valuable not just in artistic endeavors, but in practical problem-solving and business innovation. The economic impact of these establishments extended beyond their immediate operations to influence the broader commercial life of their neighborhoods. The regular gatherings of contemplative, creative people created markets for specialized goods and services. Bookbinders found customers among Hashish house patrons who wanted beautiful volumes of poetry to enhance their evening readings. Musicians discovered audiences for particular styles of performance that complemented the Hashish house atmosphere. Craftsmen found inspiration for new designs in the conversations and experiences they had in these establishments. The political dimensions of Hashish house culture were subtle, but significant. While these establishments generally avoided direct political discussion, they created spaces where people from different social backgrounds could interact as equals, developing relationships that crossed traditional hierarchical boundaries. These connections often proved valuable during times of political upheaval, creating informal networks of mutual support that helped communities survive difficult periods. The knowledge that circulated in Hashish houses was not limited to artistic and philosophical topics, but included practical information about everything from medical remedies to business opportunities. The altered state of consciousness produced by hashish seemed to enhance people's ability to make creative connections between different types of knowledge, leading to innovations that might never have emerged in more conventional settings. A conversation between a metalworker and a physician might lead to new techniques for crafting medical instruments, while a discussion between a merchant and a scholar might result in new approaches to organizing trade expeditions. The memory culture that developed in these establishments was particularly rich and complex. The combination of hashish's effects on consciousness and the oral traditions of Islamic culture created conditions where stories, poems, and philosophical insights could be preserved and transmitted with remarkable accuracy and creativity. Regular patrons developed extraordinary abilities to remember and recite long passages of poetry, complex narratives, and detailed philosophical arguments. These skills were valued not just for their entertainment value, but for their role in preserving and developing cultural knowledge. The ritual aspects of hashish consumption continued to evolve throughout this period, becoming more sophisticated and meaningful as practitioners developed deeper understanding of the relationship between preparation, consumption, and effect. Al-Tantawi and other experienced proprietors began to develop what amounted to a sophisticated pharmacology, understanding how different preparation methods, timing, and environmental factors could influence the quality and character of the experience they provided to their patrons. The sophistication of these preparation techniques reflected a deeper understanding of hashish as more than simply an intoxicant. The proprietors began to see themselves as custodians of an ancient craft that required not just technical skill, but genuine wisdom about human nature and the subtle dynamics of consciousness. They would spend years learning to read the moods and needs of their patrons, developing an almost intuitive sense of which preparations would best serve particular individuals on particular evenings. This personalized approach to service created relationships between proprietors and patrons that resembled those between traditional healers and their patients, rather than simple commercial transactions. Al-Tantawi would remember that Mahmud responded best to blends that enhanced his natural contemplative tendencies, while Hassan needed preparations that loosened his tongue and encouraged his storytelling abilities. Abu Yusuf, with his preference for silent observation, required the gentlest preparations that deepened his awareness without overwhelming his naturally quiet nature. The seasonal availability of different ingredients also influenced these preparations in ways that connected the hashish house experience to the broader rhythms of Egyptian agricultural life. During harvest seasons, when fresh herbs and spices were abundant, the blends would incorporate aromatic elements that were impossible to obtain at other times of year. These seasonal variations created anticipation among regular patrons who would look forward to particular times of year, not just for their climate, but for the unique experiences they made possible. The influence of trade networks on hashish house culture was particularly evident in the variety of preparations that became available as Egypt's commercial connections expanded. Merchants returning from expeditions to Yemen would bring back frankincense that added new dimensions to the aromatic environment of these establishments. Traders from the Maghreb would introduce different varieties of cannabis that had been cultivated in the mountain regions of Morocco and Algeria, each with its own distinct characteristics and effects. These international influences were absorbed into local traditions in ways that reflected the cosmopolitan character of Cairo during this period. The city was becoming a crossroads not just for goods and money, but for ideas and cultural practices from across the Islamic world and beyond. The Hashish houses served as informal laboratories where these diverse influences could be explored and integrated into existing patterns of social and spiritual life. The documentation of these practices in the private journals and letters of regular patrons provides fascinating insights into how individuals understood and valued their hashish house experiences. Mahmoud kept detailed notes about the effects of different preparations on his intellectual work, recording how particular blends seemed to enhance his ability to understand complex philosophical texts or to make connections between different scholarly traditions. His notebooks reveal someone who approached hashish consumption with the same systematic attention that he brought to his academic pursuits. Hassan maintained a different kind of record, collecting stories and observations from his fellow patrons and weaving them into narrative cycles that captured the essence of hashish house culture. His accounts reveal the development of a distinctive literary tradition that was emerging from these gatherings, one that combined elements of classical Arabic narrative with the more experimental approaches that became possible in altered states of consciousness. The stories that Hassan preserved dealt with familiar themes from Arabic literature, but they were transformed by the unique perspective that came from their creation in hashish house settings. Tales of love and loss took on new complexity when filtered through the enhanced emotional sensitivity that characterized these gatherings. Stories about the search for meaning in an uncertain world gained additional depth when told by people who were actively exploring the nature of consciousness and reality. Abu Yusuf left behind the most intriguing records of all, though his approach was characteristically subtle and indirect. Rather than describing his experiences explicitly, he created collections of questions and observations that captured the quality of insight that emerged from his participation in hashish house culture. His notebooks read like philosophical commonplace books, filled with brief reflections on the nature of time, identity, community, and spiritual seeking. These individual records, when taken together, provide a picture of hashish house culture that is far more complex and meaningful than the sensationalized accounts left by European observers. They reveal communities of people who were using altered states of consciousness as tools for genuine exploration and growth rather than mere escape from reality. The depth of thought and feeling that characterize these gatherings challenges any simple understanding of drug use as inherently destructive or meaningless. The medical understanding of hashish that developed in these communities was also more sophisticated than outside observers typically recognized. Experienced users learned to distinguish between different types of effects and to use various preparations for specific purposes. Some blends were understood to be particularly effective for relieving physical pain, while others were preferred for their ability to enhance creativity or promote deep contemplation. This medical knowledge was often integrated with traditional Islamic approaches to health and healing that emphasized the connection between physical, mental, and spiritual well-being. Practitioners understood that the effects of hashish were influenced not just by the preparation itself, but by the mental and spiritual state of the user, the social environment in which it was consumed, and the intentions that guided its use. The therapeutic applications of hashish house culture extended beyond the treatment of specific physical ailments to include what we might now recognize as psychological and social healing. People who were struggling with grief, anxiety, or feelings of isolation would find in these establishments not just temporary relief, but genuine support for working through their difficulties. The combination of altered consciousness and supportive community created conditions that were particularly conducive to emotional processing and personal growth. The role of music in facilitating these therapeutic effects became increasingly important as hashish house culture evolved. What had begun as informal singing and humming gradually developed into more structured musical practices that were specifically designed to enhance and guide the hashish experience. Certain melodic patterns and rhythmic structures were understood to promote particular types of consciousness, and skilled musicians began to specialize in these techniques. The instruments used in these musical explorations were typically simple ones that could produce subtle, sustained tones that complemented rather than overwhelmed the effects of hashish. The oud, with its capacity for both rhythmic accompaniment and melodic improvisation, became particularly popular in these settings. The ney, with its breathy, meditative tone, was perfect for creating atmospheric backgrounds that supported contemplation and introspection. The musical traditions that emerged from hashish house culture began to influence the broader musical life of Cairo, introducing new approaches to improvisation and composition that reflected the enhanced creativity and altered perspectives characteristic of these gatherings. Musicians who participated in hashish house sessions would bring new techniques and sensibilities to their performances in other contexts, gradually transforming the city's musical landscape. The architectural evolution of hashish houses during this period reflected their growing importance as cultural institutions. Proprietors began to invest more heavily in creating environments that would enhance and support the experiences they were providing. The simple braziers and cushions of earlier establishments gave way to more sophisticated lighting systems, improved ventilation, and carefully designed acoustic properties that optimize both conversation and musical performance. The decoration of these spaces became increasingly elaborate, with proprietors commissioning artists to create wall paintings and calligraphic installations that would provide appropriate visual stimulation for their patrons. These artistic elements were not merely decorative, but were chosen for their ability to enhance contemplation and provide focal points for the kinds of meditative experiences that hashish could facilitate. The geometric patterns that adorned the walls of many establishments were particularly effective in this regard. The mathematical precision and infinite complexity of traditional Islamic geometric art created visual experiences that seemed to parallel the mental states produced by hashish consumption. Patrons would often spend long periods studying these patterns, finding in their endless variations metaphors for the nature of consciousness and reality. The calligraphic elements incorporated into these decorative schemes were chosen with similar care and intention. Rather than random selections from classical poetry or religious texts, these installations typically featured passages that dealt specifically with themes relevant to the hashish house experience. Verses about the nature of consciousness, the relationship between the material and spiritual worlds, and the search for divine truth provided textual foundations for the kinds of conversations and contemplations that characterize these gatherings. The lighting systems developed for these establishments represented sophisticated understanding of how environmental factors could influence consciousness and social interaction. The warm, flickering light of braziers was supplemented by strategically placed oil lamps and candles that created zones of different intensity throughout the space. This allowed for both intimate conversations in dimly lit corners and larger group discussions in more brightly illuminated central areas. The placement of these light sources was carefully calculated to avoid creating harsh shadows or glare that might disturb the contemplative atmosphere. The goal was to create an environment that felt both mysterious and welcoming, one that would encourage people to relax their usual social defenses while still providing enough visual clarity for meaningful interaction. The ventilation systems that developed in the more sophisticated establishments reflected growing understanding of how air quality affected the hashish experience. Proprietors learned that proper air circulation was essential not just for comfort, but for maintaining the optimal balance between the effects of hashish consumption and the clarity of thought necessary for meaningful conversation. Too little fresh air would leave patrons feeling sluggish and confused, while too much would dissipate the aromatic atmosphere that was so important to the overall experience. The solutions that emerged from these practical challenges often demonstrated remarkable ingenuity. Al-Tantawi installed a system of small vents that could be opened or closed to regulate airflow, without creating uncomfortable drafts. Other proprietors developed techniques for using screens and curtains to direct air movement in ways that maintained the intimate atmosphere while ensuring adequate ventilation. The acoustic properties of hashish houses received similar attention as proprietors learned how sound quality affected the experiences they were providing. The goal was to create spaces where conversation could flow naturally without being overwhelmed by outside noise or internal echoes. The soft furnishings that were essential for comfort also served acoustic functions, absorbing sound in ways that made it easier for people to hear each other without having to speak loudly. The development of specialized seating arrangements reflected growing understanding of how physical comfort and social dynamics interacted in these settings. The traditional arrangement of cushions along the walls was modified to create more flexible configurations that could accommodate different group sizes and interaction patterns. Movable elements allow proprietors to adjust their spaces according to the needs of particular gatherings. Some establishments began to incorporate raised platforms or alcoves that provided different perspectives on the main room while maintaining connection to the larger group. These elevated spaces became popular with patrons who preferred to observe and listen rather than actively participate in conversations, giving them comfortable vantage points that didn't isolate them from the communal experience. The evolution of food service in these establishments reflected both practical necessities and deeper understanding of how different foods interacted with hashish consumption. The traditional offerings of dates, nuts, and simple sweets were expanded to include more elaborate preparations designed to enhance and complement the effects of hashish. Certain foods were understood to intensify the experience, while others were used to moderate its effects or to provide grounding during particularly intense sessions. The timing of food service became an important element in orchestrating the overall experience. Light refreshments might be offered early in the evening to help patrons transition from their daily concerns to the more contemplative atmosphere of the hashish house. Heartier foods would be provided later when the effects of hashish consumption might create appetite, or when the social dynamics called for the kind of communal sharing that comes with eating together. The preparation of these foods often became part of the ritual structure of the evening. The grinding of spices, the brewing of tea, and the arrangement of sweets on decorative platters provided natural breaks in conversation, while also creating additional sensory experiences that enhanced the overall atmosphere. The aromas of cooking food mixed with the perfumed smoke of the hashish to create olfactory environments that became deeply associated with these gatherings in the memories of regular patrons. The social protocols that governed food sharing in these establishments reflected broader Islamic traditions of hospitality, while also adapting to the specific needs of hashish house culture. The enhanced sociability that characterized these gatherings made the sharing of food particularly meaningful, creating bonds between patrons that extended beyond their immediate interactions. The act of accepting food from the proprietor or from fellow patrons became a gesture of trust and community membership. The economic relationships that supported these food service innovations connected hashish houses to the broader commercial life of Cairo in new ways. Proprietors developed relationships with specialized food suppliers who understood their particular needs. Spice merchants would provide aromatic ingredients that enhanced both the culinary and atmospheric aspects of hashish house culture. Confectioners would create sweets specifically designed for these establishments, using recipes that had been developed through experimentation with the interaction between different flavors and the altered taste perceptions that came with hashish consumption. These commercial relationships often involved barter arrangements that reflected the informal economic networks that characterized much of Cairo's commercial life. A proprietor might exchange hashish preparations for specialized foods, or provide evening entertainment for suppliers in return for favorable terms on ingredients. These relationships created webs of mutual obligation and support that strengthened the social fabric of the neighborhoods where hashish houses operated. The seasonal variations in food availability created natural rhythms in hashish house culture that connected these establishments to the agricultural cycles that governed Egyptian life. The arrival of fresh fruits during harvest seasons would be celebrated with special preparations that incorporated these seasonal delicacies into the evening's offerings. The scarcity of certain ingredients during difficult seasons would lead to creative adaptations that became part of the evolving tradition. The preservation techniques used to maintain food quality in these establishments often reflected traditional Islamic approaches to food storage and preparation. The use of honey as both flavoring and preservative connected Hashish house cuisine to ancient Egyptian traditions, while also serving practical functions in maintaining food safety. The incorporation of various spices served similar dual purposes, enhancing flavor while also providing antimicrobial properties that were particularly important in warm climates. The development of distinctive Hashish house cuisine represented a genuine culinary innovation that reflected the unique needs and preferences of this particular social environment. The foods that emerged from these kitchens were designed not just to satisfy hunger, but to enhance the specific types of social interaction and consciousness exploration that characterized these gatherings. They became an integral part of the overall experience rather than mere refreshment. The influence of this culinary tradition extended beyond the Hashish houses themselves to affect the broader food culture of Cairo. Techniques and recipes developed in these establishments would sometimes be adapted for use in family kitchens or in other commercial food establishments. The creative approach to combining flavors and textures that characterized Hashish house cuisine contributed to the general sophistication of Egyptian cooking during this period. The training of proprietors in both hashish preparation and food service became increasingly formalized as these establishments grew in importance and complexity. Young men who wanted to enter this profession would apprentice with established proprietors, learning not just the technical skills required, but also the subtle arts of reading social dynamics and orchestrating experiences that served the needs of diverse clienteles. This apprenticeship system created continuity in Hashish house culture, while also allowing for innovation and adaptation. Each new generation of proprietors would build on the knowledge of their predecessors, while also introducing their own insights and techniques. The result was a tradition that remained rooted in established practices, while continuing to evolve in response to changing social conditions and cultural influences. The knowledge that was transmitted through these apprenticeships extended far beyond the practical skills of running a hashish house to include understanding of human psychology, social dynamics, and the subtle arts of hospitality that made these establishments successful. Master proprietors would teach their apprentices to recognize the signs of different emotional states, to understand the needs of various personality types, and to create environments that would bring out the best in their patrons. The ethical dimensions of this training were particularly important, as proprietors needed to understand their responsibilities toward people who were placing themselves in vulnerable states of consciousness. The best proprietors developed codes of conduct that emphasized protection of their patrons' dignity and well-being, refusing service to people who were clearly unable to handle the effects responsibly, and intervening when necessary to prevent harmful behavior. These ethical standards reflected broader Islamic values about care for community members and responsibility toward those who might be in need of protection. The proprietors understood that their role extended beyond simple commerce to include genuine care for the people who trusted them with their safety and well-being during altered states of consciousness. The reputation systems that developed around individual proprietors and their establishments reflected the community's recognition of these ethical dimensions. The most respected hashish houses were not necessarily those that provided the strongest preparations, but those that created the safest and most meaningful experiences. Word-of-mouth recommendations emphasized the character and wisdom of proprietors as much as the quality of their hashish or the comfort of their facilities. The relationship between hashish house culture and the broader Islamic scholarly tradition became increasingly complex and nuanced during this period. While orthodox religious authorities generally maintained their opposition to hashish consumption, some scholars began to engage more seriously with the philosophical and spiritual questions that emerged from these practices. The quality of thought and conversation that characterized the best hashish houses made it difficult to dismiss the entire phenomenon as mere debauchery. Some scholars who had personal experience with hashish houses began to develop theological and philosophical frameworks for understanding these practices within broader Islamic contexts. They drew on traditions of mystical experience and contemplative practice to argue that altered states of consciousness could, under appropriate conditions, serve legitimate spiritual purposes. These arguments were typically made carefully and privately, given the sensitive nature of the topic, but they represented genuine attempts to integrate hashish house experiences with established religious and intellectual traditions. The influence of Sufi. Mystical traditions on hashish house culture was particularly evident in the development of contemplative practices that used altered consciousness as a tool for spiritual exploration. While most hashish houses were not explicitly religious institutions, many of their regular patrons were also participants in Sufi orders or other mystical traditions. The techniques for working with altered states of consciousness that they learned in religious contexts would sometimes be adapted for use in hashish house settings. This cross-pollination between mystical and recreational traditions created hybrid practices that were neither purely religious nor purely secular. The boundary between spiritual seeking and social recreation became blurred in ways that reflected the integrated understanding of human experience that characterized Islamic culture during this period. The artificial separation between sacred and secular that characterized many other cultural traditions was less pronounced in these contexts. The development of distinctive literary traditions within hashish house culture represented one of the most significant cultural innovations of this period. The enhanced creativity and altered perspectives that characterized these gatherings created conditions that were particularly conducive to literary experimentation and innovation. The stories, poems, and philosophical reflections that emerged from these sessions began to constitute a distinctive genre that influenced the broader literary culture of Egypt. These literary innovations were not simply the products of intoxicated minds, but reflected genuine artistic exploration that was enhanced rather than diminished by altered states of consciousness. The ability of hashish to dissolve conventional thought patterns and to make unexpected connections between different ideas created possibilities for literary creativity that were difficult to achieve in ordinary consciousness. The collaborative nature of literary creation in hashish house settings was particularly innovative. Rather than individual authors working in isolation, these gatherings created conditions where stories and poems could emerge from group interactions, with different participants contributing elements that would be woven together into coherent wholes. This collaborative approach challenged conventional notions of authorship, while creating works that reflected the collective wisdom and creativity of entire communities. The preservation of these collaborative literary works presented unique challenges that led to innovative approaches to oral tradition and memory culture. Unlike the formal manuscript traditions of scholarly institutions, hashish house literature lived primarily in the minds and voices of its practitioners. Regular patrons developed extraordinary capacities for memorization, not through rote learning, but through deep emotional and aesthetic engagement with the material they encountered. The process of preserving these works was itself a creative act. As stories and poems passed from one telling to another, they would evolve and adapt, gaining new layers of meaning while maintaining their essential character. This organic approach to textual transmission reflected the fluid, improvisational nature of hashish house culture itself. The works that survived were those that proved most resonant with successive generations of patrons, creating a natural selection process that preserved the most powerful and meaningful examples of this literary tradition. The integration of music and poetry in these settings created hybrid art forms that challenged conventional boundaries between different creative disciplines. A poem might begin as spoken verse and gradually transform into sung melody as other patrons joined in with instrumental accompaniment. These musical poems would then influence the creation of new, purely instrumental pieces that captured the emotional essence of particular verses. The result was a rich ecosystem of interrelated creative expressions that reinforced and enhanced each other. The seasonal cycles that governed agricultural and commercial life in Egypt also influenced the literary traditions that emerged from hashish houses. Spring gatherings might focus on themes of renewal and possibility, inspiring works that dealt with new love, fresh starts, and the eternal return of life force. Summer sessions, when the heat made daytime life nearly unbearable, would often explore themes of endurance, survival, and the search for meaning in harsh conditions. Autumn brought its own literary sensibilities, with the cooling air and changing light, inspiring reflections on impermanence, the beauty of decline, and the wisdom that comes with accepting change. Winter gatherings, intimate and warm against the cold outside, would generate stories about community, shelter, and the bonds that sustain people through difficult times. These seasonal variations created a natural calendar of literary moods that regular patrons came to anticipate and appreciate. The influence of trade networks on literary culture became evident in the incorporation of stories, images, and ideas from distant lands into local creative traditions. A merchant returning from Alexandria might bring tales of Mediterranean life that would be absorbed into Cairo's literary landscape. Pilgrims returning from Mecca would share stories of the diverse communities they had encountered, adding new perspectives to local understanding of human experience. These international influences were not simply adopted wholesale, but were transformed through the particular lens of hashish house culture. Foreign stories would be retold in ways that emphasized the universal human emotions and experiences they contained, making them relevant to the immediate concerns of Cairo's residents, while also expanding their imaginative horizons. The development of distinctive narrative techniques within hashish house literature reflected the altered states of consciousness in which these works were created and consumed. Traditional linear storytelling gave way to more associative approaches that followed the natural flow of enhanced consciousness. Stories might begin with a simple observation about daily life and spiral outward to encompass philosophical reflections, childhood memories, and visionary experiences, all woven together in ways that felt perfectly natural to listeners in similar states of consciousness. These narrative innovations influenced storytelling techniques beyond hashish house contexts, contributing to the evolution of oral tradition throughout Cairo. The enhanced emotional sensitivity that characterized these gatherings led to more psychologically complex characterizations in stories, with greater attention to internal experience and motivation. The collaborative nature of story creation encouraged the development of open-ended narratives that could accommodate multiple perspectives and interpretations. The relationship between storyteller and audience in these settings was fundamentally different from more formal performance contexts. Rather than passive listeners receiving finished works from authoritative performers, hashish house audiences were active participants in the creative process. They might interrupt with questions that would send a story in new directions, offer alternative interpretations that would be incorporated into the telling, or contribute their own related experiences that would enrich the narrative tapestry. This participatory approach to storytelling created works that were truly collective creations, reflecting the shared wisdom and experience of entire communities rather than individual artistic vision. The stories that emerged from these collaborative processes often had a quality of authenticity and emotional truth that was difficult to achieve through more conventional approaches to narrative creation. The preservation of the physical environments where these literary traditions flourished became increasingly important as proprietors recognized the cultural significance of their establishments. Al-Tantawi began maintaining detailed records not just of his business operations, but of the stories, poems, and conversations that had emerged in his space. These records, written in his careful script, provide invaluable documentation of literary traditions that might otherwise have been lost to time. Other proprietors developed their own approaches to cultural preservation. Some would invite scribes to attend particularly significant gatherings, creating written records of oral performances. Others would encourage literate patrons to write down their own works or the works of others that had particularly impressed them. These efforts created an archive of Hashish house literature that provides insight into the creative ferment of this period. The economic value of these literary traditions was not lost on astute proprietors who understood that their establishment's reputations for fostering creativity and meaningful conversation were valuable assets in an increasingly competitive marketplace. The best hashish houses became known not just for the quality of their preparations, but for the caliber of conversation and creativity they inspired. This reputation attracted patrons who were willing to pay premium prices for access to these rarefied cultural experiences. The development of specialized evening programs reflected this understanding of cultural value. Some establishments would designate particular nights for specific types of literary activity. Poetry evenings might focus on the creation and performance of new verse, while storytelling nights would emphasize narrative innovation and collaborative tale spinning. These specialized programs created anticipation among regular patrons and attracted new customers who were interested in particular aspects of hashish house culture. The relationship between individual creativity and collective experience in these settings raised fascinating questions about the nature of artistic inspiration and the role of consciousness-altering substances in creative work. Many patrons reported that their most significant creative insights emerged not during the height of hashish intoxication, but in the contemplative periods that followed, when their consciousness was still enhanced, but their critical faculties had returned to normal functioning. This observation led to the development of more sophisticated approaches to using hashish as a creative tool. Experienced practitioners learned to modulate their consumption to achieve states of consciousness that were optimal for different types of creative work. Light consumption might enhance sensitivity to language and imagery, while deeper states could facilitate the kind of free associative thinking that generated unexpected connections and insights. The training of young people in these creative practices often occurred informally through observation and participation, rather than formal instruction. A young man might begin attending hashish house gatherings as a silent observer, gradually learning the protocols and techniques that governed creative collaboration in these settings. As his understanding deepened and his own creative abilities developed, he would begin contributing to the collective creative process. This apprenticeship approach to creative education created strong intergenerational bonds within hashish house communities. Established practitioners would take interest in developing young people's abilities, offering guidance and encouragement that helped them find their own creative voices. The result was a continuous renewal of creative energy that kept these traditions vital and evolving. The influence of classical Arabic literary traditions on hashish house creativity was profound, but not constraining. While practitioners were deeply familiar with traditional forms and themes, they felt free to experiment with new approaches that reflected their unique experiences and perspectives. The result was a creative synthesis that honored the past while embracing innovation. The use of classical Arabic meters and forms in hashish house poetry created interesting tensions between traditional structure and experimental content. Poets might use familiar rhythmic patterns to explore themes that were far removed from classical precedents, creating works that felt both familiar and revolutionary. This approach made experimental literature more accessible to audiences who were grounded in traditional forms, while also expanding the possibilities for creative expression within those forms. The development of new poetic forms that were specifically adapted to hashish house performance contexts represented genuine literary innovation. These forms took into account the altered attention spans and enhanced emotional sensitivity of their audiences, creating structures that could accommodate both the meandering flow of enhanced consciousness and the need for aesthetic coherence. The best of these new forms achieved a perfect balance between structure and spontaneity that served both creative and contemplative purposes. The role of improvisation in hashish house creativity was particularly significant, as the altered states of consciousness characteristic of these gatherings were naturally conducive to spontaneous creative expression. Musicians would develop improvisational techniques that could respond to the changing moods and energy levels of their audiences throughout the evening. Storytellers would learn to adapt their narratives in real time based on audience reactions and contributions. This emphasis on improvisation created a culture of creative risk-taking that encouraged experimentation and innovation. Practitioners knew that failed experiments would be quickly forgotten in the flow of evening conversation, while successful innovations would be remembered and refined through repetition. This forgiving environment for creative exploration fostered the kind of bold artistic choices that led to genuine breakthroughs. The documentation of improvisational techniques through the notebooks and journals of regular patrons provides fascinating insight into the development of creative skills under the influence of altered consciousness. These records reveal systematic approaches to enhancing creativity that were based on careful observation of how different mental states affected artistic ability. The practitioners were not simply consuming hashish for recreational purposes, but were engaging in serious exploration of the relationship between consciousness and creativity. The influence of these creative innovations on the broader cultural life of Cairo was significant, though often indirect. Techniques developed in hashish house settings would gradually make their way into other performance contexts, influencing the work of professional musicians, storytellers, and poets who might never have personally participated in hashish house culture. The creative ferment of these establishments contributed to a general elevation in the artistic sophistication of the city. The cross-pollination between hashish house creativity and professional artistic traditions created hybrid forms that enriched both contexts. Professional performers who had experience with hashish house culture would bring enhanced improvisational skills and emotional sensitivity to their formal performances. Conversely, professional techniques and repertoires would filter into hashish house settings, raising the overall level of artistic sophistication in these gatherings. The role of patron artists in facilitating this cultural exchange was particularly important. Individuals who participated in both formal artistic institutions and informal hashish house communities served as bridges between these different creative worlds. They would introduce new techniques and ideas from one context to another, creating a continuous flow of innovation that benefited both formal and informal artistic communities. The seasonal migration patterns of some patrons also contributed to the spread of hashish house cultural innovations. Merchants and other travelers who participated in these gatherings in Cairo would carry techniques and ideas to other cities, while visitors from distant places would bring new influences to local creative traditions. This cultural circulation created networks of artistic exchange that connected hashish house communities across wide geographic areas. The development of regional variations in hashish house culture reflected local conditions and preferences, while maintaining common elements that made the tradition recognizable across different locations. The basic structure of contemplative gathering, enhanced by hashish consumption, remained constant, but the specific forms of creative expression, the types of music favored, and the themes explored in conversation would vary according to local traditions and interests. These regional variations created a rich diversity within the broader tradition that prevented stagnation while maintaining cultural continuity. Travelers could recognize familiar elements in hashish house culture wherever they encountered it, but they would also discover new approaches and innovations that enriched their understanding of the tradition's possibilities. The influence of local political and economic conditions on hashish house culture was complex and varied. During periods of political stability and economic prosperity, these establishments might flourish openly, developing elaborate facilities and sophisticated programming. During times of uncertainty or repression, they might operate more discreetly, focusing on core functions while avoiding activities that might attract unwanted attention. The adaptability that allowed Hashish house culture to survive under varying political conditions was one of its most remarkable characteristics. The informal, decentralized nature of these institutions made them resilient in ways that more formal cultural organizations could not match. When conditions required it, they could quickly scale back operations or temporarily relocate, preserving their essential functions while avoiding persecution. The relationship between Hashish house culture and official religious and political authorities remained complex throughout this period. While these establishments often operated in legal grey areas, they generally maintained peaceful relationships with local authorities who recognized their positive contributions to community life. The emphasis on contemplation and philosophical discussion rather than political activism helped maintain this delicate balance. The economic contributions of Hashish houses to their local communities were significant enough to give them some protection from official interference. These establishments provided employment not just for proprietors and their immediate staff, but for suppliers of food, hashish, fuel, and other necessities. They generated tax revenue and supported related businesses in ways that made them valuable community assets. The social services that Hashish houses provided were equally important in securing community support. These establishments served as informal counseling centers, creative workshops, and social clubs for people who might otherwise have had limited access to such resources. The emotional and psychological support they provided was particularly valuable in communities where formal social services were limited or non-existent. The role of Hashish houses in facilitating cross-cultural communication became increasingly important as Cairo's position as a trading center brought more foreign visitors to the city. These establishments provided neutral spaces where Egyptians and foreigners could interact informally, sharing perspectives and experiences that promoted mutual understanding. The altered consciousness facilitated by hashish consumption often broke down cultural barriers and promoted the kind of open communication that was difficult to achieve in more formal contexts. The linguistic innovations that emerged from these cross-cultural interactions contributed to the evolution of Arabic as spoken in Cairo. New vocabulary would be borrowed from other languages to describe experiences and concepts that were particularly relevant to Hashish house culture. These linguistic innovations would often spread beyond Hashish house contexts to become part of the general vernacular. The development of translation practices in Hashish house settings reflected the need to communicate across linguistic barriers while preserving the subtle meanings and emotional resonances of different cultural traditions. Skilled practitioners learned to translate not just words, but cultural concepts and experiential knowledge in ways that made them accessible to people from different backgrounds. The educational functions of hashish houses became more explicit as proprietors recognized the value of the knowledge sharing that occurred naturally in these settings. Some establishments began organizing informal lecture series or discussion groups focused on specific topics of interest to their patrons. These educational programs attracted new clientele, while also deepening the engagement of regular participants. The subjects covered in these educational programs reflected the diverse interests and expertise of hashish house communities. Sessions might focus on traditional Islamic philosophy, practical skills like bookbinding or metalworking, travel experiences and geographic knowledge, or contemporary political and social developments. The informal atmosphere and enhanced receptivity of participants made these educational experiences particularly effective. The development of libraries within some hashish houses reflected the growing recognition of these establishments as centers of learning and cultural preservation. Proprietors would acquire books and manuscripts that were relevant to their patrons' interests, creating collections that served both recreational reading and serious scholarly research. These libraries often specialized in subjects that reflected the particular character of their communities. The lending practices that developed around these libraries created additional networks of connection between patrons and between different hashish house communities. Books would circulate among individuals and establishments, carrying ideas and influences across the cultural landscape of the city. The discussions generated by shared reading experiences added new dimensions to evening conversations. The role of memory culture in preserving and transmitting the knowledge generated in hashish house settings cannot be overstated. The enhanced memory capacity that many people experienced under the influence of hashish made it possible to preserve detailed accounts of conversations, stories, and insights that might otherwise have been lost. This living library of remembered experiences became one of the most valuable assets of these communities. The techniques for cultivating and maintaining this memory culture were passed down through generations of practitioners, creating traditions of oral preservation that rivaled formal written records in their accuracy and completeness. Master storytellers and conversation leaders would train younger participants in memory techniques that enabled them to preserve and transmit complex cultural knowledge without written texts. The integration of memory practices with contemplative traditions created hybrid approaches to knowledge preservation that served both practical and spiritual purposes. The act of memorizing and reciting important texts or conversations became a form of meditation that deepened understanding while also ensuring cultural continuity. This integration of practical and spiritual purposes was characteristic of the holistic approach to human development that characterized Islamic culture during this period. The influence of these memory practices on individual cognitive development was significant, with regular participants developing enhanced abilities to concentrate, remember, and make connections between different types of information. These cognitive benefits extended beyond hashish house contexts to improve performance in professional and personal activities. The training in attention and memory that occurred in these settings created intellectual abilities that served participants throughout their lives. The collective memory that emerged from these individual practices created shared repositories of cultural knowledge that belonged to entire communities rather than individual scholars or institutions. This democratization of knowledge preservation challenged traditional hierarchies and created new forms of cultural authority based on participation and contribution rather than formal credentials or social position. The relationship between individual and collective memory in hashish house culture reflected broader Islamic understandings of knowledge as a community asset that should be shared rather than hoarded. The enhanced consciousness that characterized these gatherings made participants more aware of their connections to each other and to the broader cultural traditions they were helping to preserve and develop. The spiritual dimensions of memory practice in these settings connected to mystical traditions that understood memory as more than simple information storage. The ability to remember and recite sacred texts, philosophical insights, and meaningful experiences was seen as a way of keeping these treasures alive in consciousness, where they could continue to influence thought and behavior. This understanding of memory as active preservation rather than passive storage informed the approaches to cultural transmission that developed in hashish house communities. The seasonal rhythms that governed agricultural and social life in Egypt also influenced memory practices in hashish houses. Certain types of stories and insights were considered most appropriate for particular seasons, creating natural cycles of remembering and forgetting that kept cultural knowledge fresh and relevant. The spring return of stories about renewal and growth, or the winter circulation of tales about endurance and community, created temporal frameworks that enhanced the meaning and impact of preserved knowledge. The role of dreams and visionary experiences in hashish house culture added another dimension to memory practices, as participants would often report receiving important insights during altered states that they would then share with their communities. These visionary contributions were valued alongside more conventional forms of knowledge, creating inclusive approaches to wisdom that honored both rational and intuitive ways of knowing. The integration of visionary and rational knowledge in hashish house communities reflected sophisticated understanding of the different types of consciousness and their appropriate applications. Participants learned to distinguish between insights that were valuable primarily for personal development and those that had broader relevance for community life. This discrimination allowed for the preservation of genuinely valuable visionary knowledge, while avoiding the confusion that might result from treating all altered state experiences as equally significant. The documentation of visionary experiences through the journals and notebooks of regular participants provides fascinating insight into the development of alternative approaches to knowledge and understanding. These records reveal systematic attempts to explore the relationship between altered consciousness and genuine insight, creating informal research programs that contributed to understanding of human consciousness and its possibilities. The influence of these explorations on broader intellectual developments in Egyptian culture was significant, though often unacknowledged. The enhanced creativity and alternative perspectives that emerged from Hashish house culture contributed to intellectual innovations in fields ranging from poetry and music to philosophy and theology. The informal nature of these contributions made them difficult to trace, but their impact can be seen in the general elevation of intellectual and artistic sophistication that characterized Cairo during this period. The development of specialized preparation chambers in the more established houses represented a significant evolution in the sophistication of these operations. Al-Tantawi had recently constructed a separate room behind his main salon, where he could work without disturbing his patrons, grinding and mixing his various blends according to recipes that had been refined through years of experimentation. The tools of his trade were arranged with the precision of a scholar's study: brass mortars and pestles of different sizes, each dedicated to specific types of preparation, wooden boxes containing dried herbs and resins from across the Islamic world, and delicate scales that could measure the smallest quantities of the most potent ingredients. The process of creating these preparations had become something approaching an art form. Al-Tantawi would begin by examining his raw materials, testing their potency and quality with the same attention that a jeweler might bring to evaluating precious stones. The hashish itself varied considerably depending on its source and age, requiring different treatment to achieve consistent results. Fresh material from the Delta region had different characteristics than aged preparations from Upper Egypt, and each required its own approach to processing and blending. The grinding process was conducted with particular care, as the texture of the final preparation would significantly influence how it burned and how quickly its effects would manifest. Too fine a powder might burn too rapidly, creating harsh smoke that would interfere with conversation. Too coarse a mixture might burn unevenly, creating unpredictable effects that could disrupt the carefully orchestrated flow of the evening. The ideal consistency was something that could only be achieved through experience and intuitive understanding of how different materials behaved under various conditions. The addition of aromatic elements to these basic preparations opened up endless possibilities for customization and innovation. Rose petals gathered from the gardens of wealthy merchants would impart a delicate floral note that enhanced the contemplative mood. Frankincense from Yemen would add layers of complexity that seemed to deepen the spiritual dimensions of the experience. Ambergris, when available, would create preparations of extraordinary subtlety and power that were reserved for the most special occasions. The timing of these additions was crucial, as different aromatic elements would contribute their characteristics at different stages of the preparation process. Some needed to be incorporated during the initial grinding to fully integrate their properties, while others were best added just before use to preserve their volatile essences. Master proprietors like Al-Tantawi developed an almost mystical understanding of these timing relationships, knowing instinctively when each element should be introduced to achieve the desired final result. The storage of prepared materials required equally careful attention, as the potency and character of hashish could change dramatically under different environmental conditions. Clay vessels sealed with beeswax provided protection from moisture, while allowing the preparations to age gracefully. Different storage conditions would produce different effects over time, with some preparations improving with age, while others were best used fresh. The most experienced proprietors maintained inventories of materials at various stages of aging, allowing them to offer preparations with different characteristics according to the needs of particular evenings or patrons. The pricing structures that developed around these various preparations reflected both their material costs and the skill required to create them. Basic preparations using local materials and simple techniques were affordable for working people, ensuring that the hashish house remained accessible to the broader community. Premium preparations using rare imported ingredients and complex processing methods commanded higher prices, creating revenue streams that supported the more elaborate aspects of these establishments. The relationship between price and quality in hashish house culture was more complex than simple market dynamics might suggest. The most expensive preparations were not necessarily the most potent, but rather those that created the most refined and meaningful experiences. A preparation that promoted gentle contemplation and enhanced social connection might be valued more highly than one that simply produced intense intoxication. This sophisticated understanding of value reflected the cultural maturity of communities that had been developing these practices for generations. The development of seasonal specialties created anticipation among regular patrons and provided opportunities for proprietors to showcase their skills with ingredients that were only available at certain times of year. Spring preparations might incorporate fresh mint and early flowers, creating blends that captured the renewal and possibility of the season. Summer specialties would focus on cooling ingredients that provided relief from the oppressive heat, while maintaining the clarity of mind necessary for meaningful conversation. The autumn harvest season brought opportunities to work with fresh cannabis flowers and newly gathered aromatic herbs, creating preparations of exceptional potency and complexity. These harvest blends were often reserved for special celebrations or particularly significant gatherings, marking the transition from the productive season to the contemplative months of winter. The community aspects of these seasonal celebrations strengthened the bonds between patrons and created shared memories that would be recalled and treasured throughout the year. Winter preparations reflected the introspective character of the cold months, incorporating warming spices and deep, resinous aromatics that complemented the intimate atmosphere of heated indoor gatherings. These blends were designed to enhance the kind of profound conversations that naturally emerged during long winter evenings, when the external world seemed to disappear entirely and the focus turned inward toward questions of meaning and purpose. The influence of pilgrimage seasons on hashish house culture created additional rhythms that connected these local institutions to the broader Islamic world. The departure of pilgrims bound for Mecca would be marked by special gatherings where prayers for safe travel would be combined with the kind of profound conversations that such momentous journeys inspired. The return of pilgrims brought new stories, perspectives, and sometimes exotic preparations that had been acquired during their travels. The integration of pilgrimage narratives into hashish house culture created bridges between the contemplative experiences facilitated by these establishments and the broader spiritual life of the Islamic community. Returned pilgrims would share not just the external details of their journeys, but the internal transformations they had undergone, creating conversations that explored the relationship between physical travel and spiritual development. These discussions often revealed unexpected parallels between the consciousness-altering effects of hashish and the perspective-shifting experiences of pilgrimage. The role of hashish houses as gathering places for pre-pilgrimage preparation became increasingly important as these institutions developed stronger connections to the religious life of their communities. Groups of prospective pilgrims would meet regularly to discuss their plans, share practical advice, and prepare themselves mentally and spiritually for the challenges ahead. The contemplative atmosphere and enhanced emotional sensitivity characteristic of these gatherings made them particularly effective settings for the kind of deep preparation that successful pilgrimage required. The economic aspects of pilgrimage preparation created additional revenue opportunities for hashish house proprietors, who would sometimes organize special services for pilgrimage groups. These might include extended evening sessions focused on spiritual preparation, the creation of special travel preparations designed to ease the hardships of the journey, or the provision of meeting spaces for pilgrimage organizers and their clients. These services connected hashish houses more directly to the formal religious and commercial life of their communities. The development of networks between hashish houses in different cities reflected the mobility of their patrons and the universal appeal of the experiences they provided. Merchants and other travelers would carry recommendations and introductions from their home establishments to similar institutions in distant cities, creating informal networks of hospitality that spanned the Islamic world. These connections facilitated cultural exchange and contributed to the development of common standards and practices across different regions. The letters of introduction that traveled between these establishments provide fascinating documentation of the relationships and reputations that connected hashish house communities across vast distances. A respected patron of Al-Tantawi's establishment might carry a note of introduction to a similar institution in Damascus or Istanbul, ensuring that he would be welcomed and properly cared for during his travels. These letters often included specific information about the bearer's preferences and characteristics, allowing distant proprietors to provide personalized service to traveling guests. The reciprocal arrangements that developed between proprietors in different cities created systems of mutual support that strengthened the entire network of these institutions. A proprietor who provided exceptional service to a visiting patron could expect similar treatment when his own customers traveled to that guest's home city. These relationships were maintained through correspondence and occasional visits, creating bonds of professional cooperation that transcended local boundaries. The standardization of certain practices and preparations across different hashish house communities reflected the influence of these networks while still allowing for local variations and innovations. Basic protocols for preparation, service, and social interaction became common across wide geographic areas, making it easier for travelers to adapt to local customs while still feeling comfortable in familiar types of establishments. This balance between standardization and local variation contributed to the resilience and adaptability of hashish house culture. The training exchanges that occurred within these networks allowed promising young proprietors to learn techniques and approaches from master practitioners in distant cities. These educational journeys were similar to the apprenticeships that characterized other traditional crafts, but they were adapted to the specific needs of hashish house operation. A young man might spend months working in different establishments, learning regional variations in preparation techniques, customer service approaches, and business management practices. The knowledge that circulated through these training networks included not just practical skills, but also cultural and intellectual content that enriched the experiences provided by individual establishments. A proprietor who had studied in multiple cities would bring back stories, conversation techniques, and philosophical insights that would enhance the quality of gatherings in his own establishment. This circulation of knowledge contributed to the continuous evolution and improvement of hashish house culture. The influence of court culture on hashish house practices became more pronounced during periods when the ruling elite showed interest in these establishments. While most hashish houses served primarily middle and working class clienteles, some attracted the attention of wealthy merchants, government officials, and even members of the ruling family. The patronage of these elite customers brought both opportunities and challenges that required careful navigation. The adaptation of hashish house services to meet the expectations of elite patrons led to innovations in luxury and sophistication that eventually filtered down to more modest establishments. Premium preparations using the finest ingredients, elaborate serving implements made from precious metals, and enhanced entertainment programs were developed to satisfy customers who were accustomed to the highest levels of service and comfort. These innovations raised the overall standards of the industry while creating new market segments that supported different types of establishments. The discretion required when serving elite customers led to the development of more sophisticated security and privacy practices that benefited all patrons. Private entrance arrangements, enhanced soundproofing, and careful screening of new customers became standard practices in the better establishments. These improvements created safer and more comfortable environments for all patrons, while also protecting the reputations of customers who might face social or professional consequences if their participation became public knowledge. The political implications of serving elite customers required careful management to avoid unwanted attention from authorities or competitors. Proprietors learned to maintain strict neutrality in political discussions and to ensure that their establishments could not be used as venues for seditious activities. This political caution sometimes limited the range of topics that could be discussed openly, but it also protected these institutions from the kind of official interference that might have destroyed them entirely. The cultural influence that elite patrons brought to hashish house communities enriched the intellectual and artistic life of these establishments in significant ways. Customers with access to court libraries would share knowledge of rare texts and scholarly debates that might not otherwise have reached these communities. Musicians and poets with professional training would contribute more sophisticated artistic elements to evening programs. Government officials and wealthy merchants would bring perspectives on current events and economic developments that informed community discussions. The integration of elite cultural influences with the more democratic traditions of hashish house culture created hybrid forms that served the interests of diverse constituencies. Sophisticated artistic and intellectual programming attracted educated customers while remaining accessible to working-class patrons who brought their own forms of knowledge and creativity to these gatherings. This cultural synthesis reflected the cosmopolitan character of Cairo during this period and contributed to its reputation as a center of Islamic civilization. The architectural developments that occurred in response to elite patronage created more impressive and comfortable facilities that enhanced the experience for all customers. Larger main rooms with improved acoustics and lighting systems, more elaborate decorative programs featuring the work of skilled artisans, and enhanced comfort amenities like improved heating and ventilation systems made these establishments more attractive venues for extended gatherings. The investment in permanent improvements to hashish house facilities reflected growing confidence in the stability and legitimacy of these institutions. Proprietors who had initially operated in rented spaces with minimal improvements began purchasing buildings and making substantial modifications to create purpose-built facilities. These investments demonstrated both financial success and community acceptance that encouraged further development of the industry. The employment opportunities created by the expansion of hashish house culture provided livelihoods for significant numbers of people beyond the proprietors themselves. Specialized craftsmen found markets for their skills in creating the furniture, implements, and decorative elements that distinguished the better establishments. Musicians and entertainers developed new performance styles adapted to these venues. Food service workers learned the specialized techniques required to complement hashish consumption with appropriate culinary offerings. The supply chains that developed to support hashish house operations created additional economic opportunities throughout the region. Farmers in the Delta began cultivating cannabis specifically for the Cairo market, developing strains that were particularly well suited to hashish house applications. Spice merchants expanded their inventories to include the aromatic additives that had become popular in these establishments. Craftsmen specialized in creating the implements and furniture that were essential to proper hashish house operation. The taxation and regulation issues that arose as these establishments became more prominent and profitable required careful negotiation between proprietors and local authorities. While hashish consumption existed in legal grey areas, the obvious prosperity of successful establishments made them attractive targets for taxation. Proprietors learned to work within existing administrative frameworks while maintaining the flexibility necessary to adapt to changing political conditions. The development of trade associations and mutual support networks among proprietors provided collective bargaining power when dealing with authorities and suppliers. These organizations also facilitated the sharing of best practices and the maintenance of professional standards that protected the reputation of the industry as a whole. The informal nature of these associations allowed them to operate effectively without attracting unwanted official attention. The insurance and security arrangements that became necessary as these establishments accumulated valuable inventories and equipment created new forms of commercial cooperation within their communities. Proprietors would sometimes pool resources to hire guards or to create mutual assistance funds that would help members recover from losses due to theft or other disasters. These arrangements strengthened the bonds between establishments and created additional layers of community support. The inheritance and succession issues that arose as successful proprietors aged and considered retirement led to the development of more formal business structures that could survive changes in ownership. The knowledge and relationships that made individual establishments successful needed to be preserved and transmitted to new generations of operators. This process required careful attention to both practical skills and the more intangible aspects of community leadership that distinguish successful proprietors. The training programs that evolved to prepare successors for hashish house ownership became increasingly sophisticated as the industry matured. These programs included not just technical skills like preparation and service techniques, but also training in business management, community relations, and the subtle arts of social leadership that were essential to success in this field. The most successful training programs created partnerships between experienced proprietors and promising apprentices that benefited both parties. The documentation practices that developed to preserve institutional knowledge and maintain business continuity created archives that provide valuable insight into the evolution of hashish house culture. Proprietors began keeping detailed records, not just of financial transactions, but of preparation recipes, customer preferences, and successful event formats that could be replicated and improved upon. These records became valuable business assets that could be transferred to successors along with physical facilities and customer relationships. The quality control standards that emerged within the industry reflected growing sophistication in both preparation techniques and customer expectations. The most successful establishments developed reputations for consistent quality that required systematic approaches to sourcing, preparation, and service. These standards were maintained through careful training of staff and regular evaluation of all aspects of operations. The customer feedback systems that developed in successful establishments provided mechanisms for continuous improvement that kept these businesses responsive to changing preferences and expectations. Regular patrons would offer suggestions and critiques that informed decisions about everything from preparation techniques to entertainment programming. This ongoing dialogue between proprietors and customers created collaborative relationships that strengthened community bonds while improving business performance. The innovation cycles that characterize the most dynamic establishments created continuous streams of new offerings that kept regular customers engaged while attracting new patrons. These innovations might involve new preparation techniques, novel entertainment formats, or enhanced service approaches that differentiated individual establishments from their competitors. The most successful innovations would often be adopted by other establishments, contributing to the overall evolution of industry practices. The seasonal programming that developed in response to customer preferences and natural rhythms created anticipation and variety that sustained long-term customer loyalty. Spring renewal celebrations, summer cooling festivals, autumn harvest gatherings, and winter contemplation series provided frameworks for organizing special events that mark the passage of time and created shared memories within hashish house communities. The cultural calendar that emerged from these seasonal programs integrated hashish house activities with broader community celebrations and religious observances. This integration helped legitimize these establishments within their communities, while also ensuring that their programming remained relevant to the lives and interests of their patrons. The ability to serve both recreational and cultural functions strengthened the social position of these institutions. The educational components that became increasingly prominent in Hashish House programming reflected the intellectual curiosity of regular patrons and the proprietors' understanding of their role as cultural leaders. Informal lecture series, discussion groups, and skill-sharing workshops created additional value for customers while also attracting new patrons who might not otherwise have been interested in hashish consumption. The library and reading programs that developed in some establishments created additional reasons for customers to visit regularly and spend extended time in these venues. The combination of enhanced consciousness from hashish consumption with access to interesting reading materials created powerful learning experiences that many patrons came to value as highly as the social aspects of these gatherings. The artistic patronage that successful establishments could provide created new opportunities for local creative talent while enhancing the cultural offerings available to customers. Poets, musicians, and visual artists found both audiences and financial support in Hashish House communities, creating symbiotic relationships that benefited all parties. These patronage relationships often led to the creation of works that were specifically designed for Hashish House performance or display. The cultural preservation activities that some establishments undertook reflected their role as community institutions with responsibilities that extended beyond immediate commercial interests. The recording of local stories and traditions, the preservation of traditional music and poetry, and the documentation of historical events created cultural resources that served broader community needs while also providing unique programming for customers. The cross-cultural exchange that occurred in establishments that attracted diverse clienteles created opportunities for learning and understanding that were rare in other social contexts. The consciousness-altering effects of hashish consumption often reduced cultural barriers and promoted the kind of open communication that led to genuine mutual understanding between people from different backgrounds. The diplomatic functions that these establishments sometimes served reflected their role as neutral spaces where people with different political or religious affiliations could meet and interact safely. The protocols that govern behavior in these venues, particularly the emphasis on avoiding controversial political discussions, created environments where potential conflicts could be diffused through personal interaction and shared experience. The conflict resolution services that experienced proprietors could provide drew on their understanding of human psychology and their skills in managing social dynamics. Disputes between customers or conflicts within families would sometimes be brought to respected proprietors for mediation, reflecting the trust and authority that these individuals had earned within their communities. The counseling and support functions that hashish houses provided for people dealing with personal problems reflected their role as informal community mental health resources. The combination of altered consciousness, supportive community, and experienced guidance created conditions that were often more effective than formal counseling services in helping people work through difficulties and find new perspectives on their problems. The healing traditions that developed within some hashish house communities integrated cannabis-based preparations with other traditional remedies and therapeutic approaches. While these practices were not formal medical services, they provided valuable health support for community members who might not have had access to professional medical care. The holistic approach to health and healing that characterized these traditions reflected Islamic medical philosophy while adapting to local conditions and available resources. The spiritual guidance that some proprietors provided drew on their deep understanding of both Islamic traditions and the consciousness-altering effects of cannabis consumption. While these individuals were not formal religious authorities, their wisdom and experience made them valuable sources of counsel for people exploring questions of faith and spiritual development. The community organizing functions that hashish houses sometimes served reflected their role as gathering places where people could discuss common concerns and plan collective responses to shared challenges. While political organizing was generally avoided to prevent official interference, these establishments could serve as venues for organizing cultural events, mutual aid activities, and other community improvement initiatives. The economic development activities that emerged from hashish house communities reflected the entrepreneurial spirit of their members and their understanding of collective economic interests. Business partnerships, investment opportunities, and cooperative ventures would sometimes emerge from conversations and relationships developed in these establishments, creating economic benefits that extended far beyond the immediate hashish house operations. The technological innovations that occasionally emerged from hashish house communities reflected the enhanced creativity and collaborative problem-solving that characterize these environments. Improvements in preparation techniques, service methods, and facility design would sometimes be developed through the collective intelligence of regular patrons, creating innovations that improved the entire industry. The social reform movements that sometimes had their origins in hashish house discussions reflected the progressive values and social consciousness of many participants in these communities. While direct political action was avoided, conversations about social justice, education reform, and community improvement would sometimes lead to practical initiatives that addressed real problems in constructive ways. The literary movements that emerged from hashish house culture created new forms of artistic expression that influenced the broader cultural life of Cairo and other cities where these establishments flourished. The collaborative creation techniques enhanced emotional sensitivity and altered perspectives. Characteristic of these communities produced works that challenged conventional forms while remaining grounded in traditional cultural values. The musical innovations that flowed from these literary movements created new forms of performance that were perfectly adapted to the unique acoustic and social environments of hashish establishments. Musicians learned to work with the altered attention spans and enhanced emotional receptivity of their audiences, developing techniques that could sustain interest over extended periods, while accommodating the natural ebb and flow of consciousness that characterized these gatherings. The instrumental techniques that evolved in these settings emphasized subtlety and texture over volume and spectacle. The oud players who frequented Al-Tantawi's establishment developed approaches to improvisation that could respond to the changing moods of the room throughout the evening. They learned to read the collective consciousness of their audience, sensing when the music should become more introspective and when it should provide gentle encouragement for conversation. The percussive elements that accompanied these performances were typically minimal but precisely placed, using finger cymbals, small drums, and wooden clappers to mark rhythmic transitions without overwhelming the intimate atmosphere. The timing of these rhythmic interventions became an art form in itself, as skilled musicians learned to anticipate the natural rhythms of hashish, influence conversation, and provide musical punctuation that enhanced rather than interrupted the flow of social interaction. The vocal techniques that developed in these environments reflected the enhanced sensitivity to sound and meaning that characterized altered states of consciousness. Singers learned to use their voices as instruments of pure emotion, conveying feelings and atmospheres that transcended the literal meanings of their words. The traditional Arabic vocal ornaments took on new significance in these contexts, as the melismatic passages seemed to mirror the meandering paths of thought that hashish consumption encouraged. The repertoire that emerged from these musical explorations drew heavily from classical Arabic poetry, but transformed it through the lens of hashish house experience. Ancient verses about love and loss, spiritual seeking, and worldly disappointment took on new layers of meaning when performed for audiences whose consciousness had been altered and whose emotional barriers had been lowered. The familiar became fresh, while the profound became accessible in ways that formal concert performances could never achieve. The collaborative aspects of musical creation in these settings produced works that belonged to entire communities rather than individual composers. A melody that began as one musician's improvisation might be taken up by others, modified and embellished, until it became something that no single person could claim as their creation. These collective compositions became part of the oral tradition of particular establishments, passed down through generations of musicians and patrons, who each added their own interpretations and variations. The relationship between music and the physical environment of these establishments was carefully calibrated to enhance the overall experience. The placement of musicians within the room, the use of architectural features to shape acoustics, and the coordination between musical performance and other elements like food service and preparation rituals all contributed to creating seamless experiences that engaged multiple senses simultaneously. The lighting effects that accompanied musical performances were achieved through careful manipulation of the braziers and oil lamps that provided illumination. Musicians learned to work with the proprietors to create visual atmospheres that complemented their sonic offerings, using the play of light and shadow to enhance the emotional impact of their performances. The flickering flames seemed to dance in response to the music, creating visual rhythms that paralleled the auditory ones. The aromatic elements that were often incorporated into musical performances added another layer of sensory engagement that was unique to Hashish house culture. Special incenses might be burned during particular types of songs, or aromatic elements might be added to the hashish preparations to complement specific musical moods. These multi-sensory approaches to performance created immersive experiences that engaged the audience's entire being, rather than just their auditory attention. The seasonal variations in musical programming reflected both the natural rhythms of Egyptian life and the changing needs of Hashish house communities throughout the year. Summer performances might emphasize cooling melodies and lyrics that provided psychological relief from the oppressive heat. Winter gatherings would feature warmer, more enveloping musical textures that complemented the intimate atmosphere of heated indoor spaces. The influence of pilgrimage seasons on musical traditions created opportunities for cultural exchange that enriched local repertoires with influences from across the Islamic world. Musicians returning from Mecca or other sacred sites would bring back new melodies, rhythmic patterns, and performance techniques that would be integrated into local traditions. These musical souvenirs of spiritual journeys added international dimensions to what might otherwise have remained purely local cultural expressions. The training methods that developed for musicians who wanted to specialize in Hashish house performance required understanding not just of musical techniques, but of the social and psychological dynamics that governed these unique environments. Master musicians would teach their students to read audiences, to understand the effects of cannabis on musical perception, and to collaborate effectively with other musicians in improvised settings. The economic relationships between musicians and Hashish house proprietors evolved from simple performance fees to more complex partnerships that reflected the value that skilled musicians brought to these establishments. The best musicians could command premium compensation, but they also often became stakeholders in the success of particular venues, sharing in profits and participating in programming decisions that shaped the character of evening offerings. The reputation systems that developed around individual musicians created career paths that were unique to Hashish house culture. A musician who developed a following in these venues might eventually open their own establishment, or they might become traveling performers who moved between different Hashish houses according to seasonal demand. These career possibilities created incentives for musical innovation and excellence that raised the overall quality of performances throughout the network of these establishments. The recording and preservation of musical innovations presented unique challenges in cultures that relied primarily on oral transmission. The collaborative and improvisational nature of Hashish house music made it difficult to capture in traditional notation systems, leading to the development of new approaches to musical documentation that could preserve the essential elements while allowing for continued variation and development. The influence of Hashish house musical traditions on broader musical culture in Cairo was significant but often indirect. Techniques and styles that were developed in these intimate settings would gradually make their way into other performance contexts. influencing professional musicians and formal concert traditions. The enhanced creativity and emotional openness that characterized Hashish house music contributed to a general elevation in the sophistication and expressiveness of Egyptian musical culture. The role of women in Hashish house musical traditions was complex and varied, reflecting broader social patterns while also creating unique opportunities within the constraints of traditional gender roles. While women were generally excluded from participating directly in male-dominated Hashish house gatherings, they sometimes contributed to the musical traditions through their influence on male relatives who were active in these communities. Some establishments developed separate programs for women, creating spaces where female musicians and patrons could explore similar experiences within culturally appropriate frameworks. These women-only gatherings often featured different musical styles and performance approaches that reflected feminine perspectives on the themes and experiences that characterized Hashish house culture. The influence of female musical traditions on male-dominated Hashish houses occurred through various indirect channels. Male musicians might learn songs from their mothers or sisters that would then be adapted for performance in Hashish house settings. The emotional sensitivity and intimate performance styles that were associated with women's musical traditions often influenced the development of more subtle and expressive approaches to Hashish house music. The integration of domestic musical traditions with Hashish house performance created hybrid forms that bridged private and public musical cultures. Lullabies might be transformed into meditative pieces suitable for contemplative Hashish house sessions. Wedding songs might be adapted to celebrate the formation of friendships and communities within these establishments. Mourning songs might provide frameworks for processing collective grief or loss. The therapeutic applications of music in Hashish house settings drew on traditional Islamic understandings of music as a healing force, while adapting these concepts to the specific needs of communities dealing with altered states of consciousness. Musicians learn to use their art to guide listeners through emotional processes, to provide comfort during difficult experiences, and to facilitate the kind of personal transformation that many patrons sought through their participation in Hashish house culture. The philosophical discussions about music that emerged in Hashish house communities contributed to the development of new theoretical frameworks for understanding the relationship between sound, consciousness, and spiritual experience. These discussions often drew on classical Islamic music theory while incorporating insights that emerged from direct experience with the consciousness-altering effects of cannabis consumption. The mathematical aspects of music theory took on new significance in communities where altered consciousness made participants more aware of pattern, rhythm, and harmonic relationships. The geometric patterns that adorned Hashish house walls often reflected the same mathematical principles that governed musical scales and rhythmic structures, creating environments where visual and auditory experiences reinforced each other in ways that enhanced understanding of both. The cosmological dimensions of musical experience were frequently explored in Hashish house discussions as participants sought to understand how the microcosm of musical structure reflected the macrocosm of universal order. These conversations often drew on traditional Islamic cosmology, while incorporating insights that emerged from enhanced states of awareness, creating new syntheses of ancient wisdom and contemporary experience. The educational programs that some establishments developed around musical theory and practice provided structured learning opportunities for patrons who wanted to deepen their understanding of these arts. These informal conservatories created new pathways for musical education that were more accessible and democratically organized than formal institutional programs, while still maintaining high standards of instruction and performance. The instrument-making traditions that developed to serve Hashish house communities created new markets for specialized craftsmen, while also driving innovations in design and construction techniques. The unique acoustic requirements of these intimate venues, combined with the enhanced sensitivity of Hashish-influenced listeners, created demand for instruments with particular tonal qualities and expressive capabilities. The woodworkers who specialized in creating ouds for hashish house musicians developed techniques that emphasized resonance and sustain over volume and projection. The metal workers who crafted finger cymbals and small percussion instruments learned to create pieces that could produce subtle variations in timbre and pitch that would be barely noticeable in other contexts, but crucial in environments where every nuance of sound was magnified by altered consciousness. The string makers who supplied hashish house musicians developed specialized products that were designed to remain stable under the temperature and humidity variations that characterized these establishments. The burning braziers and aromatic preparations created environmental conditions that could affect the tuning and tone of stringed instruments, requiring strings that could maintain their musical qualities under these challenging conditions. The maintenance and repair services that developed around hashish house musical instruments created additional economic opportunities, while also ensuring that the quality of musical offerings could be sustained over time. Skilled craftsmen learned to work with the unique wear patterns and damage that resulted from regular use in these environments, developing repair techniques that could restore instruments to optimal performance standards. The collection and preservation of musical instruments became important activities in some hashish house communities. As valuable pieces were recognized as cultural artifacts that connected contemporary practitioners to historical traditions. These collections often included instruments that had belonged to famous musicians or that had been associated with particularly memorable performances, creating tangible links to the cultural heritage of these communities. The apprenticeship systems that developed for training musical instrument makers ensured the continuation of specialized craft knowledge, while also creating opportunities for innovation and improvement. Master craftsmen would take on students who showed aptitude for this work, teaching them not just technical skills, but also the aesthetic sensibilities and cultural understanding necessary to create instruments that would serve the unique needs of hashish house communities. The trade networks that supplied raw materials for instrument construction connected hashish house communities to broader commercial systems, while also creating economic incentives for the continuation of these cultural traditions. The demand for high-quality wood, metal, and other materials created markets that supported traditional crafts while also encouraging innovation in materials and techniques. The export of hashish house musical instruments to other cities and regions helped spread the influence of these musical traditions, while also creating additional revenue streams for local craftsmen. Instruments made in Cairo might find their way to Damascus, Baghdad, or Istanbul, carrying with them the musical innovations and aesthetic sensibilities that had developed in Egyptian hashish house communities. The documentation of instrument-making techniques through written manuals and apprenticeship records created valuable resources for preserving craft knowledge while also facilitating innovation and improvement. These technical documents often included not just construction details, but also theoretical discussions about acoustics, materials science, and the relationship between instrument design and musical expression. The standardization of certain instrument designs across different hashish house communities created common platforms for musical collaboration, while still allowing for local variations and innovations. A musician traveling from one city to another could expect to find familiar instrument types that would allow them to participate in local musical traditions, even if the specific performance styles and repertoires differed from their home communities. The integration of musical instrument making with other crafts created opportunities for cross-pollination between different technical traditions. Woodworkers who made furniture for hashish houses might also create instruments, bringing aesthetic sensibilities from one craft to another. Metalworkers who created serving implements might also make percussion instruments, applying their understanding of how different alloys affected sound production. The artistic decoration of musical instruments created additional opportunities for creative expression, while also connecting these functional objects to broader aesthetic traditions. The calligraphy, geometric patterns, and floral designs that adorned instruments often reflected the same artistic sensibilities that influenced the decoration of hashish house interiors, creating visual coherence that enhanced the overall cultural experience. The symbolic meanings that became associated with particular instrument types reflected their roles in hashish house culture, while also connecting them to broader Islamic symbolic traditions. The word, with its complex construction and sophisticated musical capabilities, might represent the complexity of human consciousness and the possibilities for spiritual development. Simple percussion instruments might symbolize the fundamental rhythms that connect individual experience to cosmic order. The ritual uses of musical instruments in hashish house ceremonies created sacred dimensions to what might otherwise have been purely secular cultural activities. The blessing of new instruments, the ceremonial passing of instruments between musicians, and the retirement of instruments that had served their communities for many years created opportunities for collective recognition of the spiritual dimensions of musical practice. The healing applications of specific instruments drew on traditional Islamic medicine while adapting these concepts to the particular needs of hashish house communities. Certain types of drums might be understood to have therapeutic effects on particular physical or emotional conditions. String instruments might be used to facilitate meditation and contemplative practice. Wind instruments might be employed to guide breathing exercises that enhance the effects of cannabis consumption. The gender associations of different instrument types reflected broader cultural patterns, while also creating opportunities for women to participate indirectly in hashish house musical traditions. Instruments that were considered appropriate for women might be played in domestic settings and then adapted for use in male-dominated hashish house gatherings. The musical knowledge and techniques associated with women's instruments might influence the development of performance styles in mixed-gender or male-only contexts. The age-related traditions surrounding musical instruments created frameworks for passing cultural knowledge between generations while also marking important life transitions. Young men might receive their first instruments upon reaching adulthood, marking their entry into the adult male community of hashish house culture. Elderly musicians might pass their treasured instruments to younger practitioners, creating bonds of mentorship and cultural continuity. The regional variations in instrument construction and use reflected local materials, climate conditions, and cultural preferences, while maintaining enough commonality to support inter-regional musical exchange. Instruments made in Upper Egypt might use different woods than those constructed in the Delta region, but they would still be recognizable and playable by musicians from other areas. The innovation cycles that characterized instrument development in hashish house communities created continuous streams of technical and aesthetic improvements that kept these crafts vital and responsive to changing needs. Master craftsmen would experiment with new materials, construction techniques, and design concepts, testing their innovations in the demanding environment of actual musical performance. The quality control standards that developed within instrument-making communities ensured that products met the high-performance requirements of professional musicians, while also maintaining the aesthetic standards that were important to hashish house culture. These standards were enforced through guild-like organizations and reputation systems that rewarded excellence while penalizing inferior work. The pricing structures that governed instrument sales reflected both the material costs of construction and the skill and reputation of individual craftsmen. Basic instruments suitable for amateur musicians were priced to be accessible to working-class patrons, while premium instruments for professional performers commanded prices that reflected their superior materials and construction quality. The financing arrangements that developed to make quality instruments accessible to musicians who might not have been able to afford immediate full payment created additional economic relationships within hashish house communities. Proprietors might advance money for instrument purchases, or groups of patrons might pool resources to acquire instruments that would be shared among community members. The insurance and protection arrangements that developed around valuable instruments reflected their importance to their owners, while also creating additional economic relationships within these communities. Musicians might pay fees to proprietors in exchange for secure storage of their instruments when not in use. Community funds might be established to help replace instruments that were lost or damaged. The inheritance and legacy issues surrounding musical instruments created additional frameworks for cultural continuity, while also recognizing the personal attachments that develop between musicians and their tools. Instruments might be passed down within families, donated to community institutions, or sold to fund other community needs, depending on the wishes of their owners and the needs of their communities. The symbolic roles that certain instruments played in community identity created additional layers of meaning that extended beyond their purely musical functions. A particularly fine oud that had been associated with memorable performances might become a symbol of community achievement and cultural sophistication. A drum that had been used in important ceremonies might represent the spiritual dimensions of community life. The diplomatic functions that musical instruments sometimes served reflected their role in facilitating communication across cultural and linguistic barriers. Musicians traveling to foreign cities might use their instruments to demonstrate their cultural background and to establish credibility within local musical communities. The universal language of music could create bonds between people who shared no common spoken language. The educational roles that musical instruments played in hashish house communities extended beyond their obvious function in musical instruction to include broader lessons about craftsmanship, aesthetic appreciation, and cultural values. Young people who learned to play instruments would also absorb understanding about the importance of patience, practice, and dedication to excellence. They would learn to appreciate the relationship between technical skill and artistic expression. The therapeutic applications of musical instruments in addressing specific physical and emotional conditions drew on traditional healing practices while adapting them to the particular needs of hashish house communities. Musicians might use their instruments to help patrons work through grief, anxiety, or spiritual confusion, creating musical environments that facilitated emotional processing and personal growth. The community-building functions of musical instruments reflected their power to create shared experiences that transcended individual differences and created bonds of mutual understanding and affection. The act of making music together, whether as performers or as audience members, created forms of intimacy and connection that were difficult to achieve through other means. The cultural preservation roles that musical instruments played in maintaining connections to historical traditions ensured that contemporary practitioners remained grounded in the wisdom of their ancestors while still being free to innovate and adapt. Old instruments carried within their construction and decoration the aesthetic values and technical knowledge of earlier generations, serving as tangible links to cultural heritage. The economic development functions that musical instrument making served in supporting local communities created additional justifications for the continuation of these traditions beyond their purely cultural value. The employment opportunities, skill development, and commercial relationships that grew around instrument making contributed to community prosperity while also maintaining cultural traditions. The technological innovation that occurred within instrument-making traditions reflected the creative problem-solving that characterized hashish house communities, while also demonstrating the practical applications of enhanced consciousness and collaborative thinking. New construction techniques, material applications, and design concepts might emerge from the collective intelligence of communities that were regularly exploring altered states of awareness. The artistic influence that musical instruments had on other creative traditions reflected the integrated nature of hashish house culture, where different art forms influenced and enhanced each other. The visual design of instruments might influence architectural decoration, while the acoustic principles that governed instrument construction might influence the design of performance spaces. The spiritual dimensions of musical instrument making connected these practical crafts to broader questions about the relationship between material creation and spiritual expression. Craftsmen might understand their work as forms of devotion, creating objects that would serve sacred as well as secular purposes. The process of construction might itself be understood as a form of meditation or spiritual practice,